Welcome to another episode of Exist for Others, a series where we highlight staff members of Church on Main. Be inspired and learn more about the people who help us share the goodness of God in our church.
What is up, guys? Hope everybody's having a great day. Today, we are starting our Existing for Others series where we're going to let you guys really learn about the people who help us with that statement of living for God, existing for others in our church. And today, I have with me a guy who I call B Money, Brandon Rosko, the Executive Pastor of Operations. How you doing today?
Good. Great, man.
Good. That's awesome. So I wanted to talk to you today for a couple reasons. For starters, I think a lot of times when people hear the term pastor, they think of the person who speaks on the pulpit every single week. And your job is almost the exact opposite of that. You're somebody who works behind the scenes. So kind of give us a slight job description of what your role entails here at Church on Main.
Wow. Okay. Great. So my role, I'll start this way. Essentially, I am here to hold up Brian's arms. And then in connection with that, the other part of it is to serve the church. So it's kind of like being a go-between between Brian and the congregation and kind of ensuring that things that are set aside from his vision are executed and take place, and then the needs of the congregation are met. So it starts from that broad lens, but then it filters down into a bunch of strategic areas. So the easiest and most obvious thing that most people know that I do is related to the finances of the church. And so oversee the budget, the budgeting process, where we stand from a debt management standpoint, and everything contained within from a financial perspective. But it builds down where it's the facility, it's IT, it's marketing, it's our website. It pushes down into our food service industry. And now in this latest season, I've taken on a more leadership role on staff management as well. So HR is included in all of that. And so really it's anything that happens within a normal, typical business that most people don't assume happens at a church, because when they come to church on Sunday and they experience the service and they see, Brian up there preaching,
right,
or Kellen up there, or Kyle, depending on which service they go to, singing or leading worship. And, I'm up there occasionally, but not as frequently, so they might think, oh, I don't know, what does he do? Because he doesn't do as much on Sunday. But
right,
typically my bulk of my work occurs Monday through Friday.
That's awesome.
Versus Sunday morning.
That's awesome. So I wanted to talk to you because I know that you have a great testimony. Talk a little bit about how you got your story into Church on Main from a corporate perspective. Because I think a lot of times what we see happen with pastors is they feel like they were called at 8 or 9 years old. They go to high school, they go to a seminary college of some sort, and then they intern at a church, and then they get a role somewhere in the youth department, and then they get an executive role, and then they become an executive pastor or senior pastor. But I know that your route was a whole lot more unorthodox. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. The typical executive pastor just kind of falls into that role at a lot of churches, and it's usually because they're doing a great job at whatever they were brought onto the staff to do. Right. So I was specifically brought on to do that job. So that was kind of a different curveball where, I spent 20 years in corporate America doing several different jobs, and it was actually two different times, so about 17 or so years, and then about 2 years. So you kind of combine them together, and it made the 20. And each time those roles were very different. Yeah. And spanned a lot of behind the scenes IT type job roles to a lot of customer facing roles, a lot of data. So it combined a lot of different skills that I wound up using on a daily basis. But my path was much like most people's, right? I went to college. I got a 4-year degree, an undergrad degree, and then I went back after a couple of years of working, got my master's degree, so I have an MBA in marketing. And so my path is not like your typical path like you mentioned. However, I sort of ran or sort of knew I was called to ministry for about 7 years before I did anything with it. I wasn't sure. And so, I just kind of went day by day through the journey, day by day, and, just kind of trusted God that when God thought it was time and thought I was ready, he would open a door. I wasn't quite sure how, because I didn't have the Bible degree. Right. I didn't have the seminary. I didn't have the traditional path. So I was like, all right, if you're going to do this, he's going to have to figure out how to make it work with me and my background and my skill set. So Short version of a long story is I was essentially mentored by a guy who was the administrator at Woodstock. His name's Dan, and he spent time with me and just invested in me as a person.
Yeah.
Without really the goal of me working ultimately in this world, but just all the time that he spent and all the discipleship and all that kind of experience with him led me down a path of ultimately sensing God's call on my life, working with him. He kind of discipled me through what does that mean? What does that look like? How does this work? To leaving the corporate world and taking on a consulting type job for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Where Snellville was a client
of ours.
Yeah. So met Brian, met Joe, met Trent, met Jackie, some other staff members working through some different behind the scenes financial projects for Snellville. And that's where I met, the team, and kind of when the position became open, they reached back out and tried to see if I had any interest. So it is not your typical path, not your typical pattern. But it is one of, step by step, day by day, just kind of following through on what I felt like God was leading me into. And I'll tell you this, I did that experience, and the crazy part of it all is I know I'm called to ministry. And I know I stepped out in faith at the right time. God confirmed that through a lot of other reasons. And I know I was working for the person that I knew that God told me I needed to work for. But the cool and interesting thing that wasn't cool or interesting at the time is it didn't work. And so financially, it just didn't work, even though he's an expert in the industry, and I think I have some decent skills. Yeah. But the combination of us together just didn't wind up working. So I went back to the corporate world because I knew I needed to provide for my family. Right. And that limited experience of 2 to 2.5 years of doing this consulting work, working with churches, was the hardest, most challenging, but most rewarding work I ever did in my life. Yeah. So I went back into corporate world. It was the least rewarding, least challenging, least fulfilling job I ever did, the easiest and highest paying job I've ever had in my life. Yeah. Well, okay, great. I had money. Right. And I was able to be with my family and do different things, but it was miserable. Yeah. Because I knew God called me into ministry. He led me to take that step of faith. For whatever reason, it didn't work. And this show's not long enough for me to explain that, but I could. And just kind of walking through that whole process just led me to a place where just in humility, I knew like if God was going to open the door, it would have to meet certain requirements. Like my family had to be on board. It had to be the right situation with the right kind of pastor leader. Right. It had to be the right situation with the right kind of team scenario situation. And I just kind of had this unofficial list of if that ever existed, then I would know that God is confirming this is the right step for me. Yeah. And this opportunity through this church and with Pastor Brian is what matched up exactly with what God laid in my heart. And that's awesome to hear, and I know that you've been a blessing in my life as well as a lot of people here at Church on Main. I want to go back to something you said. You said that it was about 7 years that it was on your heart to go to ministry. I think a lot of times, my question to you when you say that is, do you think that when God is pulling our heartstrings and really telling us to do something, do you think you can make a decision too early, and do you think you can make a decision too late based on your experience? For sure, too early, 100%. Yeah. That one's an easy no-brainer to me. It's the advice I got from Dan as he was mentoring me, because he was the first person I told. I told him even before I told my wife. Right. I was like, I don't know what this is, but this is what it feels like. He's like, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. You're called to ministry. But he told me, don't live in two worlds. God's revealed that to you. Right. And you just got to trust him and walk with him. Can't serve two masters. Can't serve two masters. Right. And you have a calling to your family first to provide for them. So you need to do a great job at the work you're doing as God comes alongside you and shows you how he's going to use you in ministry. And that's just kind of the way it came together. Can you do too late? Probably. Yeah. And, push come to shove, based on my experience, maybe I stepped, even though it took about 7 years, maybe I stepped too early because it didn't work. Right. But I also think you need that not work experience, and you got to fail, and you got to kind of fail in a way that, all right, let me rethink this. And that can build you to a whole different perspective and mindset as you launch forward down the road. You do a lot of entrepreneurial type things, and man, 2 out of 10 entrepreneurial ideas, if they work, man, you are highly successful.
Yeah, 80% of businesses fail within the first 5 years.
That's what I'm saying. So so it's the same thing with when you're walking with God and trying new things. Certain things will fail, and that was all part of the design, right? It wasn't because I did something wrong or I had a sin issue in my life. It was because God had to get a hold of my heart and to see how much I trusted him.
Yeah.
And he saw how much I trusted him, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And so he had to show me this lesson. Hey, you're in ministry now, but that's not what this was all about. Even though I thought it was all about, hey, I feel called to ministry. So now that I'm in ministry, I've arrived.
Right.
And so that was not what God wanted me to think or have my mindset. It was, it was very prideful of me to think,
right,
I have achieved this thing. And you're like, no. This was just your first step to get to where I needed you to go, but I needed you to think and have your heart shaped a whole different way. I'm going to teach you a different way of how to get humble.
Yeah.
And he did.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. And I appreciate you sharing that. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, so as the executive pastor, you said one of the things that you kind of focus on is finances. And so my question to you is, I've heard you say before in your messages in your podcast that money is one of the most talked about subjects in the Bible, right? So there's this weird, I guess, like paradox dichotomy in the world where like people say like, in order to be a strong Christian, and you've heard it before, you can't necessarily have financial success. And then you have the prosperity gospel, which talks about, well, if you honor Jesus, you'll be rich. If anybody was really like, okay, Brandon, I've listened to all of this. What are your thoughts on this as a whole? What would you tell them?
Sure. Bible talks about finances more than not more than any other subject, but one of the highest topics.
Right.
And I think it's 2 reasons. One is often misunderstood. And 2 is one of the things that traps most people easiest.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those hidden things.
Yeah.
Right? So I can tell you I tithe.
Right.
I can tell you I give generously. You can't prove it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that type of experience is, okay, this is one of those things that is really personal, but if we can make it really about discipleship, it doesn't have to be so personal. And so that's, I try to lean into that lens when I share about it, but kind of the topic of it itself, it breaks down. You can take all these verses, you summarize them all up together. And like I said, it's a true spiritual test of the condition of your heart is how generous you are.
Right.
And so there's no 9%, 10%, 20%. There's no percentage that measures your heart. Only God can do that.
Right.
And through his word, he evaluates that. And it's not just a Old Testament principle. It's not just a New Testament belief. It is throughout the entirety of Scripture. And a lot of topics that we tend to get hung up on aren't as comprehensive as the way we handle our finances.
Wow.
And so that's why I think it's so important, because it is there's so much attention spent to it by God himself and even Jesus too.
Wow. So with my last question, I've seen how Church on Main has impacted your life. I've seen how it's impacted your family's life. So if there was ever anybody who's listening to this and says, man, I really want to check out Church on Main to see what they have to offer, to see how I could be a part of it, what would you tell them if it was somebody for the first time listening to this?
Sure. Easiest, best way is come and see, right? That's, what Jesus said to each one of the disciples that followed him was, come and follow me. So you may not be brave enough to follow me personally, but come and follow the Savior, the Lord that I follow. And you can do that in community here at Church on Main. So doors are wide open. We'd love to have anybody that is interested or curious or any of those things. You can obviously check us out online, and that product is okay. But the experience of worship and relationship with others is a big part of your Christian walk, and the best way to experience that is in person. So come check us out.
I appreciate it, brother.
Yep.
Thank you.